Okay, now we can see your screen.
I hope you could see and hear that. Could you hear it?
We could only see it.
Oh, it sounded so good. Um, well, that's a collection of his work on YouTube. And as you could see, there was Lucille Ball, names from long ago, Danny Thomas, Lucille Ball, ABC Television's The Invaders, the FBI. Alan worked for Quinn Martin Productions and Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. And he directed numerous commercials. One of them there was, those of us who are older will remember, Ajax laundry detergent. But he directed hundreds of commercials. So let's start at the beginning. Alan Lee is the fourth generation in his family to live in Koshkonong Prairie. He was born on what is now the Kelly Farm since 1945 at the corner of Liberties and Oak Park Road. And that was the farm of his great-grandfather, Shure Requi, and Shure Requi sold the farm to Alan's grandfather, Nils Anderson Lee. The Lees were a very, very wealthy family. And I would say Nils Lee, his grandfather, was about as wealthy a landowner entrepreneur as you could have in rural Dane County at that time. His arch enemy and someone who he played, I would say, a playful game of one-upsmanship was Torger Thompson. The two of them trying to outdo each other in funny ways. It was friendly. I think he began the first telephone exchange. Nils Lee began the first telephone exchange in rural Dane County history, and he made an enormous amount of money hooking that up to the Bell telephone system. But before that, he viewed farm work as, well, of course, very difficult, and he did not enjoy it. So at a young age, he started hiring crews from freshly arrived Norwegians, and they were his threshing crews, and he leased them out all across Dane County. And that's how he made his money, and that's how he was able to buy the Requi farm. That, and besides the fact that he married one of the Requi's daughters, Mari Requi. So Allen Lee's great-grandfather left all this money to his children, and he left them large interest in Farmers Insurance Company and many businesses. Of all of that, all of it would disappear in the Great Depression. Their fortunes went south fast. So Allen's father was Sievert Lee. Sievert Lee is the brother of my grandfather, Peter Lee. Sievert Lee had tremendous interests in land and he owned part of the Bank of Deerfield, and he ran the Farmers Insurance Company. Allen was so wealthy growing up that my Aunt Eunice said he's the first person she ever met who actually had a checkbook. So on the farm, he rode horses, he loved horses, and he raised horses. He also played tennis on that farm. They had a tennis lawn. And something he would do later in Hollywood, they played polo. He and his two best friends, Donald Robertson and Lyman Mullen, all from Deerfield and all related to me somehow, played polo, and they rode horses. They were sportsmen. All three went to the University of Wisconsin together in 1926. And in 1930, a great tragedy happened, probably one of the worst things ever to happen in his life. Celebrating graduation from the University of Wisconsin, Allen, Lyman Mullen, and Donald Robertson, the three Deerfield boys. Donald Robertson, by the way, was the nephew of Hannah Robertson, who was married to Meyer Mickelson of the Mickelson store in Deerfield. And she's well known, of course, as Hannah Mickelson. Donald got out of, they stopped after celebrating in a series of taverns at night, and they stopped along the Wisconsin River. And you cannot say the name Wisconsin River without immediately thinking of tragedy. I've never heard anyone equate the Wisconsin River with a bright, wonderful sunny day and a pleasant outing. It's always tragedy. As many of you know, there's a ferocious undercurrent in that river, and it runs fast, 23 miles, 24 miles an hour, some of it. And Donald got out in the middle of the night, and it was snowing, and he was going to relieve himself in the river. And as he stepped out, a car came by very fast, out of nowhere. He could barely see the lights, the boys later said. And he had one choice: get hit by the car or dive in the river. He dove in the river, and he was swept away. And it was the greatest search in Wisconsin history for a missing body. And it was the first time the state of Wisconsin employed airplanes to try and find his body. Donald Robertson's body was found 8 miles downstream from the bridge where they stopped. And Allen was devastated, completely devastated. And also that same year, the Depression hit hard. He no longer had money. And the family, as the family's fortunes dwindled, they had to go and seek employment elsewhere outside of the traditional employment that was handed down from their great-grandfather. So there was one opportunity left. Allen's brother took it, and that was running the Farmers Insurance office in Deerfield. Allen went to Racine to work in a mattress factory. And there's nothing worse than working in a mattress factory at that time. And he went through a number of jobs, and he got married, first of many wives. He had 4 wives, I think. We don't know. He might have had 5. We don't know. He loved a lot of women. And he couldn't stand it anymore in the area. The Depression hit so hard that he migrated west. He went to Hollywood. There, his fortunes changed. He became a radio announcer and he worked for the Sears Company. And to augment his income, he joined the United States Cavalry Reserve. And of course, by then, they still rode horses then, but he would be learning armored vehicles. He'd be training in armored vehicles, but they still rode horses. And their emblem that they wore on their uniform was a horse. So he did all of those things, and then World War II broke out. Alan he never talked about it, but he was actually, as we learned later, the first American to cross the Siegfried Line. And that is interesting because his real name, Alan's real name, I'm going to keep calling him Alan to avoid confusion. His real name, he had to change, was Adolf Siegfried Lee. And World War II forced him to change that name. He joined, he was in the Army, he was in the 13th Armored Division. They entered Paris. Alan led General Patton's army through Paris. Well, how did that happen? He was in what was known as a command PEEP unit, and that was a lightly armored unit that went ahead of the main army. So Alan faced constant combat day after day after day. And how we know about him is from a young French resistance fighter named Olaf Morteau. And Olaf, whose mother was Norwegian, fought with the French underground, and Alan picked him off the street to be his interpreter and his guide. Olaf helped Alan get through Paris, and Patton's army followed. He fought his way into Germany. According to Olaf, Alan crossed the Siegfried Line, Germany, the night before the official crossing. So he reconnoitered and he was in there. And he said Alan Lee is actually, in reality, the first American to cross the Siegfried Line. So at this point in his life, the job of his command PEEP was to make contact with the enemy constantly, every day, to be ambushed, to whatever hit him. So his world is constant combat all day, all night, never sleeping, always under fire, always pushing ahead, finding the German army, and always making contact. He would be the first contact, constantly. After 60 days of this, he was in bad need of rest. He'd be suffering what we call today PTSD. They didn't have that then. It hit him hard. He was finally wounded, and he remained in Germany, in France, and in England until 1946, when he finally came back home. After all that combat, and after being wounded, and suffering tremendous PTSD nightmares all the time, he decided he was not going to work an ordinary job. He was going to find a way to do what he dreamed of, and that was be a movie director. So he'd always loved the movies, and he collected posters during the silent era, and he had a massive poster collection, which I do not have. I wish I did. It was donated. I do have his things, which I donated to Dana. I don't know if she brought them to the meeting or brought some of the photographs, but Alan returned home, and he got a job at Sears because they had to give GIs the job they had before the war, after the war. Right away, he became in charge of Sears' brand new audiovisual department. He directed the first Sears TV commercials. He wrote them. Within a year, he was flying back and forth from Chicago, Sears in Chicago, to New York City to produce commercials, and his reputation started to grow. He wrote these commercials. He hired a lot of popular writers. He worked very closely with a writer named Jacqueline Suzanne, who wrote The Valley of the Dolls, which was a bestseller back in the 1960s. She was sidelighting, moonlighting then, writing commercials. His job grew. He had more responsibility. He was in Chicago at the right time. They were making a new thing called industrial films for Ford Motor Company, Wabash Railroad, so many. Allen worked as a director on these, and he climbed up the ladder. In 1956, he moved to Hollywood. He made the big move. He was hired by Desilu. Desi Arnaz himself hired Allen, and he was hired to direct all the commercials and live commercials. A lot of them were done live for the Danny Thomas Show, which was a very popular show in the late 1950s. After that, he got work at Quinn Martin Productions and Debbie Reynolds Productions. He directed Debbie Reynolds television specials. He directed a thing called Scopatones, which were early music videos. Debbie Reynolds owned Scopatones, part of Scopatones. You can see those on YouTube, and you could, if I were you, I would go to The Web of Love by Joy Lansing, which was an early Scopatone. And if you see that, you'll recognize, and if you see that, and if you're of a certain age, you'll recognize Joy Lansing from the Beverly Hillbillies. Allen began working for Quinn Martin Productions in 1964. And then,
Can you pause for a second, Frank? We got weird sound stuff again.
okay,
Wanted to say, what? Can you guys hear this one better? Frank, you can talk.
where did I leave off before weird sound?
Okay, if that was working fine, I'll just shut my off. Doing her thing.
All right,
Get on it. Just
keep
go.
going.
Okay. At Quinn Martin Productions, Allen was in charge of promos, and he was a second unit director. He did a lot of jobs. So he worked on a film on these series: The Defenders, Burke's Law, The FBI, The Invaders. And The Invaders was his final job in Hollywood. He was much older. He was, when he left the military in World War II, he was 35 years old. So 36. He was already, he was really the old man. Everybody in his unit was 18, 19, and 20, and he was in his 30s. So he kept an office in Hollywood at 1440 North Las Palmas, General Service Studios, and his office was right next to his good friend, Buddy Ebsen. And that's when I met Allen, after The Invaders. He was very kind and took me on many studio tours, personal studio tours. I got to see the sets of Night Gallery, the Beverly Hillbillies. I met all the cast. I got to cut a piece of film for the first time in my life. And I was old enough to be interested in the business so I could ask Allen questions and talk about it. He directed one feature film. It's called The Desert Raven, 1965. It's a drive-in movie, and it played the drive-ins from 65 to the early 70s. It seemed to always be recycled as a second or third feature. And that film is lost today. And I'm sure it's out there because they made a lot of prints, and it was a major release in 1965 that I'm searching for. Allen went into semi-retirement in the 1970s. He became interested in his family again. So he came back to Deerfield, a lot of trips, and reconvened with all of his cousins, his Lee cousins. And it's interesting to note that at that time, the Lees were pretty much removed from Deerfield. So a family that had once figured prominently and owned a great deal of land around Deerfield and had been the economic engine of the town of Deerfield in the 1800s and the early 1900s. They were gone, and they are gone today. They're not there. I cannot think of any Lee relatives in Deerfield or in the immediate area. I think Margaret Lee and Nels Lee were the last Lees to live in Deerfield. And time went on. Allen had a quadruple bypass surgery in the early 1980s, and that was not good. It removed him from society, and he died in his home in Tarzana, California. He had a nice ranch-style home that was right next to the home of the Howards, his good friend Rance Howard, who's the father of Clint Howard and Ronnie Howard, the director. So he knew the boys very well, Ronnie Howard especially. When Allen died, his body was whisked back to the Deerfield Cemetery, the former Lee Cemetery. And I was a pallbearer at his funeral and gave one of the two talks at his service. So in 1996, Allen passed away, and he was laid to rest with all the Lees in that corner of Deerfield Cemetery. And that is all. That is my story of Allen Lee.